This special episode is part of our Critical Engagements with Histories of Whiteness seminar series, in which we explore the shifting contours of racialized whiteness in South Africa, its privileges, policing, and enduring presence in our contemporary landscape. We are joined by Professor Neil Roos, who reflects on the complicity of ordinary white South Africans under Apartheid. Drawing on his book, Ordinary Whites in Apartheid Society, he offers a rigorous and deeply human account of how whiteness was lived, policed, and sustained through everyday structures of power.
This was a book about whites. In particular, it was a book about ordinary whites, a group who are described generally as a heterogeneous mix of people from the working class, people who broke their way into the middle class, the destitute, and those who were separated from the mainstream of respectable society. I argue that this history is central to understanding the dynamics of the apartheid social order as a whole. Fundamentally, it's a book about complicity, about accommodation. And it also demonstrates the contested nature of what it meant to be white. That white people, while they might have opposed the form, the cultural styles, the aesthetics, the surveillance imposed on them by the apartheid state, didn't actually reject the privileges which it offered. Their rejection of the particular forms which apartheid took meant that after apartheid, many whites, especially of the generation whom I interviewed, well, we didn't support it, we didn't have anything to do with it. So I take on that question during the course of today's talk. But let me tell you how I plan to proceed. And I'm sorry, I'm not very good with these PowerPoint things. Firstly, I'm old. Firstly, I'm old. Secondly, I'm a left-wing historian. Thirdly, I'm thick. So I'm going to talk first of all about how I got into writing particular kinds of history, and hopefully explain some of the background to the study and some of the historiographic vectors, some of the political concerns which I brought, because writing history is a deeply political activity. It's not a methodological one. Methodology flows from politics and theory. It's not like you can go and learn 5 methods for writing history, as some of the graduate schools in the country do. And I'd like to talk briefly along the way about my use of the word ordinary. Otherwise, perhaps that can come up in the questions. Then I want to turn more concretely to the history of working class people, of ordinary people in apartheid society, and try to address questions around their complicity. Now, I went to university in 1982, and the day that I arrived at the then University of Natal was a momentous day in South African history. It was the day that trade union organizer Neil Agate was murdered by the police. It was a horrible day to arrive on campus, and it made things very visible to me. Here was a white man like me. Well, I was still really a boy then, just over 17 when I got to the University of Natal. He had the same name as me, and he'd been murdered by the police. Made it very graphic. Apartheid killed. At the University of Natal, I soon became caught up in the sort of temperament of student politics. And one of the things that attracted me to history, I didn't know whether to do a degree in biology or a degree in history. See, I wanted to be a teacher. It was the only way that people like myself could get to university if someone else paid. And I didn't know whether to become a teacher, a teacher of biology or a teacher of history. But history won over because I was very impressed by some historians who I encountered, particularly the urgent attention which they drew between what they researched and what they taught, and kind of anti-apartheid mobilization which derived from their work. And there were some fantastic examples across the higher education system in South Africa in the early 1980s. And this was a connection emphasized by Rick Turner, who's South Africa's forgotten activist intellectual. And he'd been murdered again by the apartheid police about 4 or 5 years before I got to the university, 4 years before I got to the University of Natal. But his figure still loomed massively over the institution. I say that he was the most important scholar at the University of Natal in 1982, even although he was 4 years dead or 5 years dead. And there were still students who'd been taught by him, so his memory was very much alive. And I soon learned to admire the social history at the University of the Witwatersrand, which championed history as a mobilizing tool in the struggle against apartheid. Now, the histories which were being written at what Charles van Ansel, the historian, has called the House of Concrete at Wits, were concerned largely on urban life of black people and the making of the black working class. And these historians were interested in resistance, and they sought to write the hidden histories of those who were excluded from mainstream narratives of the past. And from the outset, this history was activist, it was insurgent, and it had clear objectives for political and social mobilization and transformation. I still have this image of the late Phil Bonner, one of the social historians, standing rather hopelessly with a megaphone, trying to direct people at a May Day rally to go here and not there. And of course, no one paid him any attention, but there was Phil Bonner with his megaphone. But that's the spirit of that movement. They were deeply involved in the political currents of the time, and it appealed to me. I conducted my first research on white communists in the 40s and 50s, and I later realized that actually there were so few that you could probably count the number of white communists, white progressives, in the late 40s, the 50s, and into the 60s on one hand, and still have your pointy finger and left over, that I became more interested in the majority of whites who didn't support apartheid. And I began to draw on work of people like the Americanist Du Bois, the South African journalist and, again, underrated intellectual Saul Plaatje, and also David Rodiger, to connect class formation and race formation. As I looked at histories of veterans who'd served, white veterans who'd served in the Second World War, a book which Professor Albert Hundling once reviewed very, very generously for me, in American Historical Review. Now, strange phenomena emerges out of that history, and it's a phenomena which I see played out again and again and again and again and again. These men claimed throughout the war and after that they're anti-fascist. They claim that they are anti-apartheid, and you can still see these claims played out on Facebook today in reference to one Sailor Malan. And in 1951, they mobilized and they marched on the government, and they could need, if they hadn't, let me not say if they were sober enough, but if they hadn't messed things up, they could have forced the government of the day out of office, physically forced the government out of office in Cape Town, but they botched that. Yet, so on the one hand, they're claiming all these anti-apartheid credentials. They are marching against Malan, the Prime Minister, and they call him Mala-Nazi, a play on the Nazis. Yet, not for a minute do these dudes repudiate the benefits, the privileges of being white and being a man in a patriarchal, racist society. And you find in their documents these outraged statements about who has the greatest claim to save white civilization. The moles who benefit from it now, or us heroes who went to go and fight the Nazis. So there's this weird disjuncture of being anti-apartheid among whites in South Africa. And it's played out many, many times, again and again and again. And it's this kind of disengagement and denial of ties to apartheid. I think ties in today to claims made by the white right in South Africa and the Trump administration that legislation to address racialized inequalities are racist laws. Now, after writing Ordinary Springboks, which was the book about those men, I became interested in not only a group of men, but a society, in this case, white society, which was marked by these contradictions of denying, of repudiating, opposing apartheid, yet being deeply ingrained in it. And I started reading books that I could find, but I actually didn't see myself or people like me. My father was a waiter. I was the first in my family to get matric. Obviously the first to go to any type of tertiary education. Books that I read didn't describe us people. They were related to the literate classes, people who left written records. And then some of the other studies were thoroughly off-putting to me as well, not least of all the genre of war memoirs from men of around my age, which sought to sanitize their history, limit their choices, sort of paint a rosy picture of themselves. I couldn't relate in any way to those histories, perhaps because I was a draft dodger myself. But anyway, I found the historiography on white people in this country extremely flat, narrow, cardboardy, overplaned, generalized, and unacceptable. And for me, growing up in late apartheid, in the heart of a working class district of Durban, for me as a historian thinking about, as an adult and a historian thinking back about apartheid, and the situation of white people in it. Apartheid was everywhere, but it was nowhere. Just take a look at that picture. Someone commented on it, how kind of creepy the picture is. This is a picture which was taken by the photographer who took the picture on the cover of that book. And in a sense, it's grotesque. These people are deeply immersed in apartheid. They're deeply immersed in a vilely unequal society, yet there's no signs of it anywhere. They're playing the guitar, they're dancing, so yet they're immersed in this society. And it's this image, in a sense, captured what I wanted to write about. I wanted to capture the things which aren't shown in the picture, but are everywhere there, if you look a bit harder. And in 2007, I came into contact with a group of German historians who were at that stage beginning to write histories of German life in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Not so much the war years, but German life in places like Hamburg, Red Hamburg, in Berlin. Got it, okay? And I was very, very taken by their work. And what I found is that they were interested more in accommodation than in resistance, which was a theme of South African social history. And I found this would be a theme for this kind of history. And I also began to read Arendt, not her whole over, but particularly Achman in Jerusalem and her work and her idea of the banality of evil, where she spoke about morality being inverted, where things that are morally acceptable become unacceptable and vice versa. And that seemed to me to be a theme. Now, tethered to Arendt, I did also begin to use selections from subaltern studies to underpin what I called ordinariness. This was mainly by constantly moving my text away from very generalized ideas of domination and subordination to allowing us to think about categories that shift. People are dominated at certain times and subordinate at those times too, and they dominated other times. And it allowed me, as one of the reviewers said, to show how those on the margins of whiteness at any given time and who threatened the boundaries of the race and class structure of apartheid society attracted the attention of the apartheid state and institutional measures of discipline. But there's an important caveat. While I did draw on subaltern studies to work on ordinariness up to a point there, to look at those who were dominated, it must be understood that even as they might have been dominated within apartheid society, within the white reaches of apartheid society, every single white South African was fundamentally part of the dominant. So one must be careful in that use of the idea of subalternity. But I used it to look at, basically methodologically, to look at questions of who was subordinate, who was dominated at particular times, and what happened to these people. And we can pick that up pick that theoretical point and methodological point up in the discussion if anyone so wishes, because I do want to turn on to the actual context of the book. And in the book, I do start talking about poor whiteism, which most of you will be familiar with. One cannot understand the history of whites in apartheid society without understanding the traumas of the poor white years, where, in a nutshell, the elites of white society were very worried that poor whites would give up the question of racial loyalty, racial solidarity, and they would become like my grandfather and live in mixed slums, find closer allies with black people than white people. And there were all sorts of measures, not least of all sex laws, so-called civilized labor laws, job color laws, to separate and uplift white people and black people during the 10s, the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. But I'm not going to go into that, assuming that most people have a general knowledge of it. Now, the chapters of the book were based in three. First of all, there were a couple on science, ideology, and policy, some on work, and then some on transgression. Let me touch briefly on each of these. First of all, science, ideology, and work. And I argue that state policy towards the ordinary whites I talk about was premised on substantial intellectual work. And as I say, this was in turn founded on the experience of poor whites. And probably the leading figure who undertook that work was one Geoffrey Cronje, who was the second highest paid official at the University of Pretoria, professor of social work, sociology, and criminology. In the 1950s, the biggest academic department at any university in South Africa. And he was extremely influential. And at a particular moment in the late 1940s and 1950s, the alignment of political forces within the National Party and the state allowed him to have immense influence, not only in the realm of ideas, but in policy too, because he sat on every commission and every board that you could think of, and he managed to introduce his agendas and have these played out. And his work gives us some idea of the links between class prejudice, racial paranoia, ideology, and science, and how these translate into discipline and regulation and the management of whites in apartheid society. He believed that white people were threatened, particularly Afrikaners, by what he calls blood impurity. And in one of the later talks, Suzanne is going to talk about that. Now, obviously, he's worried about the mixing of white blood and so-called black blood, if such a thing exists. And he calls that the insloper. He said that that's how something sneaks into white society. But there's another type of blood mixing which Geoffrey Cronje worries about as well, and this hasn't been picked up in the literature. He's a student at this seat of learning in the 1920s, as were a lot of the Afrikaner nationalist intellectuals of the day. And in the 20s, there's a hell of a lot of incest cases in white society. So that's another type of blood mixing, which he gets very, very worried about. He's not only worried about the mixing of black and white blood, which will give you, I don't know, green blood with pink spots or something, but he's worried about what happens in families. And that's why in his writings, he's so concerned about what happens within Afrikaner families. He's not just interested in what happens across this street and that street and whether this person is having sex with that person of a different race from across the street. He's worried about what is happening within families, especially in isolated communities. And that was for him, I think, a very important element of his blood mixing, of the blood mixing that he worries about. And I don't want to talk too much about Cronje, but suffice to say that the point I'd like to leave us there with is that we have this major intellectual. He's the driving scholar of the intellectual firmament at the time. He's like a Pumla or an HIV scientist today. You know, the go-to people in the academy. And what he's worried about is blood mixing. And who's having sex with who. And what deviance is. He's very, very worried about deviance, not among black people, but among white people. Then this is where apartheid society gets its ideas from Uncle Geoffrey. Let's move on to work. Again, this was a very detailed set of chapters, and I'm going to touch on just one point on work. We find the staatsdienst, the public service, expanded massively under apartheid, and it expanded for oaks that look like me. People like my grandfather who couldn't get jobs, and people who looked like my mother or my grandmother. But initially, when I started this book, I actually wanted to do a book on the staatsdienst. I admired a historian of Europe called Perry Anderson, who'd done some wonderful work on European bureaucracies, and I wanted to do something similar, but I didn't, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But for now, let me tell you what I did find out about the bureaucracy. It expands and it's rapidly Afrikanerized. And we find that it's organized around the principles of scientific management, which emphasizes quality control, efficiency, human resource management, industrial psychology. And normally these principles are applied to industry, but it was something of a novelty and a world first that here it's actually applied into the bureaucracy. What's it? What's crazy guy called? Crazy guy with cars? I think he must have learned something from this. So anyway, 2 points come into this. We find that in the civil service is that it's grafted onto the ideological concerns of Afrikaner nationalism. The principles there help us think about ideology and the regulations and forms and conventions upon which white people in the civil service were subject to. It also helps us to explain how the public service labor process enabled white public servants to perform their daily tasks without having to act in specifically racist ways or demonstrate any specifically explicit political partisanship. The work in the public service was highly atomized and compartmentalized, and it was subject to measurement and scoring and assessment. So you couldn't sleep on your job, news to me. Now, this is precisely one of the places where, for the production of Arendt's banality of evil, where one can do or participate without actually seeing the whole picture, if you don't want to. And this explains in part some of the terms of white public servants' incorporation into the apartheid civil service. But I think it's absolutely essential here is that we avoid assertions which are ultimately made in bad faith of plausible deniability that the civil servants didn't know, which one might call the Eichmann defense, because we see many instances, which I'm alas not going to go into, of civil servants defying, of civil servants disrupting work, of civil servants taking their own initiatives and making race in different ways to how the civil service was imposing it. Let me give you one small example. In 1951, or was it 1952? No, it was 1957. One G.D. Opperman is riding his bicycle down the offices of his public service building in Pretoria, and he knocks over, I quote, a native worker who's not happy being ridden over by Opperman on his bicycle. So he gets up and he delivers a hearty clap to Opperman. Now, in the nature of South African masculinity, one would have expected these matters to rest there. You know, boys will be boys, and sometimes they corner each other, but it didn't. This initiated a vast disciplinary procedure. There are files and files and files on the Opperman case. It eventually leads to him being sentenced to 3 months of hard labor in prison. He's fined and he's demoted. What does that tell us? It tells us something very important about violence in apartheid society and its relation to whites. Apartheid society was fundamentally violent. It couldn't be anything else. But the way violence was enacted was very much to be controlled by the state. We can see from this correspondence and the punishment which Opperman received, that it didn't go for random violence. It didn't want random violence, which might upset the dynamics of this emerging social order. And in a sense, it meant that the violence of apartheid, as it was relayed towards white people, and black people, was far closer to that which characterized Nazi Germany in its more institutional sense than the Jim Crow violence of the American South. More on that, any questions are asked, because I want to have 2 minutes more on just to talk very, very briefly on the work colonies. Now, the apartheid society acted to punish whites who transgressed, and one of those were a set of institutions called work colonies. And I encountered work colonies in the archives when I was starting out on this project. As I said, I wanted to do a project on the apartheid civil service, and then I found these references in the state archives to work colonies. And I'd spent a career reading South African history. I hadn't seen one reference to a work colony. So I started digging into these places, which were places where men deemed miscreant were disappeared because they were out of sight. So they were sent there for a lengthy spell of rehabilitation. Robert Morrell, in his review, points out that this was the major act of discovery in writing this book, because no one else had written on the work colonies. In a sense, it was. But actually, it was a double act of discovery, because later on, when I read another archive and I saw a list for the train, which was developed by the Durban Men's Welfare Society to send men to a work colony. Who do I find on it but Father Roos? and his brother, my uncle. They'd been sent to the work colony until the day they died. They never mentioned it. So this was a place of shame. It was a place of hiding. It was a place where transgressors were sent to be punished and to sanitize the landscape of whiteness. You don't want to see whites who drunk, whites who are gay, or in the words of one case here, someone who sold 3/4 of a bottle of brandy to a native and exposed himself to 3 ladies in church, presumably white ladies, in Church Street, Pretoria. So it's these kind of people who are sent away as apartheid goes about cleansing its body of men who it does not want to see. And it doesn't put them in camps just down the road here, although ironically there was one near Stellenbosch. It sends them into the back of beyond, where no one can see these camps. In all the research, I only found one photograph of a work colony. So the point being is that, and I could go more into it, but I'm not going to because I want to conclude, that a strong element of what the state does in keeping white people complicit is its surveillance of them, its punishment of them. But all the while, we find people are able to defy this. They're able to run away. They get voluntarily consigned, so they've got a place to stay in these work colonies in winter. And eventually the project gets abandoned because more than 50% have run away at any time. So there are possibilities of transgression, of defiance. And our crucial question is defiance up to what point? And that's the point I'm going to use to round off over here. I think, if we to avoid what E.P. Thompson has called the enormous condescension of posterity, we need to understand how white people were drawn into apartheid society, how they were policed and how they were surveilled and how they were reformed. Even the sense that they were being watched, policed, suspected of, was far more imagined than real. But we also need to ask where and how they transgressed, and importantly, the limits of such transgression. That's the crucial question, the limits of such transgression. And as I've said, the whites who feature in this book, none of them broke the social codes of white supremacy. None of them repudiated white supremacy. The whites who'd appeared in the earlier book, the communists and other radicals which Albert reviewed, those whites did. But the whites here, these ordinary whites of the 60s, none of the whites who feature in this book say segregation is wrong. Not one. Not one of them. They defy it, but their opposition is fundamentally limited. They're not heroic figures, obviously. And as Alf Lütke, famous historian of Germany, says, we must absolutely avoid writing their history with boundless sympathy. And there is, moreover, no room for apologia in writing the history of whites in a racist society. We've seen traces of indocility. We even see cases of collaboration across the color line, which I can go into, but I haven't had time to now. So these whites define particular forms of the apartheid state, but they seldom challenge the order of racial supremacy, of which apartheid was but one bureaucratic, political, ideological iteration. And in fact, I think that's why so many could claim subsequently, besides bad faith, of course, that they don't support apartheid. They didn't support apartheid. And I think that ultimately this history of working class and other ordinary whites in early apartheid society leaves us facing similar dilemmas to the historian of working class life in Germany in the 1930s. That there's strong ties which bind these people into apartheid society. But we cannot write histories which deflect moral blame from these people. We absolutely cannot. They were part of it, and I think it's wrong historiographically, morally, to turn our attention to convenient scapegoats like powerful politicians, like important bureaucrats, like murderous policemen. While ordinary white people defied in a myriad of ways, our core idea, again, is the limits of this defiance, and it was very, very hard to find any, especially in the period under review here, which is the 50s and the 60s, who defied the shape of the racial order as a whole. Thank you for your patience.
I will always be drawn in by your presentation style. Neil doesn't teach, he preaches. So I always am very drawn in by the presentation style. Thank you so much for that talk and for providing a very clear overview of the impetus behind the book itself, and then also the content that the book focuses on. I had the privilege at the end of last year to submit the review for the book, and it has been something that's been a guiding text for my own research on whiteness. So I'm going to open up with something that you referred to in the talk, but I think we can speak about it, because when I was developing the concept for the seminar series, for people who have read it, and if you have time to read it after today's seminar, I'm influenced very heavily by Neil's work when I conceptualized the idea for the seminar series. So this idea of defying and complying, this idea of being both disciplined and forming part of this dominant class, because Neil doesn't just generally look at whiteness, he also uses the realm of the ordinary, which offers a different kind of grappling with how whiteness was developed, molded, and shaped, particularly under apartheid, and particularly within this 1950s to 1960s period. So my first question relates to the civilizing of the white body. Whiteness is not something that was inherent, or we definitely know that race is not biological, but you refer to the figure of Geoffrey Cronje, and I think that can be our starting point for the conversation, focusing so heavily on the white family. In the book, Neil says Cronje, to the effect, Cronje was the one one of his generation most obsessed with whiteness. And Cronje is of the generation of Verwoerd, of Werner Eiselin, who develops Volkenkunde at Stellenbosch University. He's of that generation. So while his contemporaries is trying to identify and crystallize the idea of the other, Cronje is fixated upon whiteness, and the white body becomes central. And here, in reference especially to the colonies and hard labor, I would like us to open our conversation surrounding how the white body is civilized.
Thank you very much. But when we talk about Geoffrey Cronje and we talk about his civilizing, taming, and controlling of white bodies, I think in relation to that man in particular, it was more Afrikaner bodies. And I use two cases of my grandfathers. My one grandfather was an Afrikaner who committed that most cardinal of sins. He became an Engelsman. And he was subject, he and his progeny was subject to immense disciplining by Geoffrey Cronje, and we'll talk about what he did in a moment. But on the other hand, my other grandfather, who was old Natal, with all that goes with it, and as far as I know, my mother quite severely, who he entirely escaped the disciplining gaze of Geoffrey Cronje and his sociologist, and he became a very respectable, white Natal man of the time. I'm sure he even played bowls and drank tea, and I know he did drink far too much gin. But besides, so there we have it. One, there's a disciplining of an Afrikaner body more than a Greek and English-speaking one. Those came later, but what does he do? Geoffrey Cronje is interested in families, and these miscreant men who occupy the work colonies are where he focuses his attention. And it's interesting because other Afrikaner nationalists before and after are very worried about Afrikaner women and their capacity for giving birth to children who are not an Afrikaner. But Geoffrey Cronje focuses on men, and he spends a great deal of time determining what is a deviant man and then correcting these men. So he takes them to the work colonies and he gives them 3 exams. He gives them a medical exam, which is the normal, sort of health and so on. We're going to talk about that. He gives them a psychological exam, which is the one I believe President Trump has just had to show that he's an incredible genius. And then he gives them a sociological exam, which bizarrely includes elements on church attendance and masturbation. I don't know why he was that interested in these. But he then, having examined them, he then gives them their treatment in the work colony. Because remember, Geoffrey Cronje doesn't see himself as a jailer, he sees himself as a social worker. So he treats people. He doesn't do punitive things against them in his own mind. So he gives these men labor therapy, which means today you dig a hole over there and tomorrow you cover it up. And part of this was a physical rebuilding of these men, because the majority of men who arrived at the work colonies were very ill from excessive drink, and they'd probably lost a ton of weight and hadn't been eating. So that becomes a focus of Geoffrey Cronje's work in rebuilding these men and also making sure that they stay sober. They keep on running away. One of the work colonies supervisors writes in great anguish that they cavort with black women and smoke dagga, which is, not exactly what Geoffrey Cronje has in mind, but he's trying to restore them to some physical and, in his mind, moral wellness. When men are let out of the work colonies, they are, here's an important point, they are placed under probation. Foucault tells us that the highest form of discipline is when you're not disciplined by a state, an institution, or an individual, but the discipline is interior. So what happens with probation is that we find men let out and their social workers go and see them. And if their boss tells them that Yanni was drunk for 3 weeks and didn't come to work, then that poor character is back to the work colony. One individual who I interviewed, a fellow called Vas, ends up under probation. And because the boss in the civil service who he works for is a National Party hack, Van ends up being a party hack for the National Party on election days, sort of going and putting up election posters and driving people to the polls and all. So he doesn't only become a party hack, but he doesn't only become a public service hack, he becomes a National Party hack as well. And he remains sober until the day he died. So that is a part of what Cronje is doing. Attached to that, he likes to find out what's happening to families in the work colonies. As I told you, Geoffrey Cronje is head of sociology, social work, and criminology, which has got 1,500 students in the 50s, which is a big department. Many of the social workers are employed by the state. If you're in a work colony, a social worker goes out to check on your family, which gives him an entry point to penetrate the homes of whites, to make sure that the mother was coping, that she wasn't drinking as much as her husband, that they were actually married, that the children were going to school. And always the threat was of taking children away. And I could talk about children being taken away, but I'll leave that for now.
Yeah, I've so many questions, but our timekeeper is staring me down. But my question here is you make reference to restoration and this idea of redemption.
Yes.
And you refer to it briefly in the talk, especially surrounding poor whiteism.
Yes.
because this is also and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, a classed intervention. So that is the one question that I'm interested in, is your work operates in this realm of the ordinary, and you purposefully move away from looking solely at a character like Grenier. You look also within the realm of the ordinary. And within that realm, the book itself is profoundly personal at times. You open up with the story of your mother, Sheila. She says she hated the Nats and she was class conscious, but the class consciousness never crossed the color line, even though she had a close relationship with two women and she had an affinity for betting, horse betting. But her awareness of the sort of evils of apartheid never transgressed or never went beyond her own personal wild experience. So I want you to respond firstly to your usage of the ordinary, and then second also those who occupied the space of the ordinary. So that class awareness as well.
Right. Okay. Let me. I'm probably going to botch this question. It's a concept I've worked with so long that it gets to the point where I feel I sometimes don't have as tight a grip on it as I did when I started, or as I would like to at this stage. And I apologize for that. Now, the question of the ordinary came out from a number of theoretical readings which I did, and training which I did, particularly under, working with the subaltern studies scholars, where I spent much of my time when I was at the University of Chicago on a fellowship many years ago. I grappled with class, with social history's fixation with class. But I grappled with it in quite incoherent ways, because if I looked around me and I explained and I tried to address the phenomena that I was interested in, they didn't stop at the frontiers of class. I was force-marched as a bursary boy into a boarding school with boys who came from very different social worlds to our, yet everyone shared pretty much similar outlooks, aspirations, and if I'd stuck with the social history version of class, where do I draw the lines? So I got close to well, I suppose earlier iterations of the subaltern studies approach, the more historical wing of it, before it went more towards studies of representation, when it was a radical social history of below, and it did in fact draw heavily on the work of the social historians at Wits to show how historiographies move around. Now, the difference is that probably the first major, or one of the founders of the historical wing of subaltern studies, Ranajit Guha, he used ethnography rather than theory as an entry point into society. He looked at the categories he saw emerging. He saw that issues like language, like ethnicity, like region were actually often more important as starting points than class. And that idea drew me to that wave of it. And I thought that I could then approach people who were within apartheid society, but were not necessarily your preachers, your university people, your politicians who left voluminous records. So, and write the categories as they organized themselves and as they shifted. And it's a project which I'm going to continue in my new work. So writing the ordinary allowed me to use categories as they were shaped by elites, or as they emerged from the bottom. And it allowed all sorts of people to occupy that. If we look at the word, let's take the populations of the work colonies, for instance. It would be very difficult to use a strong class perspective to write about these poor, woe-begotten men who ended up there. But if we take the categories which I call them apartheid's miscreants, the work colony superintendent called them blanca Tutsis, which was a racialized, for those who not familiar with the language, it's a racialized way of saying like white black thugs. Those men crossed class. They, by and large, they're from the working class, but they included lawyers, they included teachers, they included all sorts of other men who, for one reason or another, who'd fallen into this category, which was created by the architects of the work colony, such a category of people who could be admitted, could be healed, but needed some labor therapy for that. And that's how I use the category of the ordinary. And it allowed me to drill down, I think, into some very small and interesting categories, which come out perhaps more in the book.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open up because I think there might be questions. So, Prof. Quinlan, I'm going to take one question at a time.
Okay, yeah.
Neil, riveting as always. I've just got two comments. I'm glad you raised Geoffrey Cronje, because Stellenbosch is a foreign figure. Stellenbosch thinks they're responsible for everything. And I think Geoffrey Cronje makes it very clear that apartheid had a strong kind of northern impulse. And then I've been here long enough to raise Stellenbosch again in the second part of my comment. And you mentioned region just at the end of it, yeah, when you spoke about ethnographic categories. I think one looks at whiteness at Stellenbosch, which I'm trying to do right now and stuff that I'm writing. The key theme there to me will be that of ordentlikheid.
Yes.
Respectability. Now, a lot of kind of assumptions feed into that kind of ordentlikheid. And I think one needs to unpack that. But that'll be different from the assumptions prevailing in Pretoria and elsewhere.
Yes.
Then finally, just a comment really which struck me when you spoke about children being taken away and the effect of that. That, of course, was the case with Francois Slubbert. His father disappeared during the Second World War. His mother was alcoholic. His grandfather took charge eventually. And he came to Stellenbosch from quite a different perspective. He came from a kind of underclass perspective. And he looked at Stellenbosch differently. He looked at South African white society differently. And I think that kind of class awareness made him realize that he's part of a bigger whole. He's not part of the Stellenbosch, although he could act accordingly. But ultimately, he knew what the game was about. But anyway, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Could I respond briefly to?
Briefly, so that we have
Sure.
time.
Okay. So Cronje and his major acolytes are from the University of Pretoria. Another one is one called Janie Petersen, and one who I'm beginning to work on is a psychiatrist from Wits who did a PhD under Cronje called Louis Fried. When we talk about region and the organizing themes of being white, here, as you say, it's ordentlikheid. Where I grew up in the industrial areas of Durban, it was not being ordinary, but it was being not Afrikaans, or not being like a railway child. And I have a salacious story to tell about that, but I'll never be allowed back in Stellenbosch and I'll tell it, and we're under the interest of time, so I won't tell it. Francois Slubbert, at a personal level, it has some resonance with me about class awareness. As I say, I was a scholarship boy at a school which was far too big for its boots. And I was reminded every bloody day that I was a scholarship boy, that my father was a waiter, that we lived in council flats, and that we did not own a motor car. And that bred in me a sort of lifelong awareness of difference. which I mean, I'm not no fun sale slub, but I mean, I think it makes me understand the sense of being out while also kind of being inside an elite institution.
Sophia.
Thank you so much for a brilliant presentation, Professor Roos. I really enjoyed that a lot. And my question is a bit related to this very complicated term of ordinary that
Yes.
you've addressed a few times. So I had a really strange experience when I saw your book for the first time, because while doing my PhD research, I interviewed someone who talked, it was related to museums and museum collections, and he used to go out into the former homelands and buy things, cultural artifacts, and sell them to museums. And anyway, it was a long and complicated story, but in one story, he referred to himself as an ordinary white. He said something along the lines of, he had had an encounter with some apartheid policemen, and he said they didn't want ordinary whites wandering around in the homelands without their papers. So I found this term really striking, and I actually titled that chapter Ordinary White. So when I saw your book, what is this about? So I guess my question is really, one, it's sort of ordinary white as a self-identification. Is that in the sense there's a sort of academic rationalization that you put forward as a methodology of, why ordinary? Is it, who would be the extraordinary white? And what is the aspect there of the people that you engaged with? Would they potentially self-identify as ordinary whites? Is it a form of homogeneity or seeking homogeneity? And then also any reflections you have on how this concept has aged, or what is an ordinary white today? Is it a historical concept? What is its legacy? What happened to ordinary whites? Are they, and I suppose, what's the connection with privilege? I mean, you explained that class becomes the sort of potential barrier, but what's the connection even between the ordinary white and white privilege? And that legacy?
Okay, I do my best. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer the third question especially, but I think for me, when people self-identified as ordinary whites, the heuristic purpose of such self-identification was to say that they were not part of the repressive apparatus of the state. That's the key purpose of it. It's a distancing mechanism, and many of the whites whom I interviewed were in that position. I don't think I interviewed. I think I interacted with one cop, but it was in a written form. But I don't think I interviewed one person who'd been in the police, in the military, or something. So I suspect that most of them would have identified themselves as ordinary whites. Has the concept aged? If I think generationally, I don't think it has aged. And I battle to get a grip on post-apartheid white youngsters. And I don't think that the concept, as I applied it, works quite as well. There's other historical methodologies, other historical definitions which do explain post-apartheid whites, and none put better than Jansen in his knowledge of the blood, in how he talks about racialized knowledge passing down, and we can see it all too sadly in TikTok and other things. But the kind of ordinariness which implied subordination and domination at the same time in a more theoretical sense, I don't think it applies to the Y2K whites. And we need a different set of theoretical tools, I think, to write that. Yes, whiteness matters. Yes, race especially matters. But I don't think that the idea of of the category and the methodological approach of the quotidian. Maybe the latter might work, but the category I don't think would work anymore. And there's a third reference to ordinary white, someone who I regard as much of a mentor, David Rodiger, has brought out a book called An Ordinary White.
In the talk, you made a striking point that apartheid was fundamentally violent. And your first, at least in the talk, you speak about your first encounters with political deaths, white political deaths. In the book, you speak about your first encounter with death itself, the story of Derek, someone from your community, and who commits suicide because I think it's found out that he is in a relationship with a black woman.
Yes.
And I think you say that this is the predicament in which apartheid and love had left him. It's in the last chapter of the book. But my question here is very broad, and I think you can give a broad response.
Sure.
When did white South Africans realize that apartheid was violent? Because the apartheid violence had been openly enacted against black South Africans. So when did white South Africans encounter that violence? Is it when one of their own died? So the question there is, especially because it resonates with you, that political death resonates. But I think the image that is up here, you said apartheid is everywhere, but nowhere.
Yeah.
And this seems very jovial, but then when I think of my own personal encounters, for instance, my mother will speak about, she didn't go out at a certain time because of police presence, and it dictated black movement all the time, from past laws to histories of further racialization. And I think that is the question, that when did white South Africans realize that apartheid?
Okay, there's an answer in two parts. About the Derek death, and I was a little boy. So I follow my colleague Leslie Witz, and I fictionalize here. I make myself 20 years older in part of those conversations in the bar, drinking beer and mourning his death, where conversations would go so far, and then there would be this uneasy pause where we don't go, that he killed himself on the train. But the question of his love across the color line would not feature in those conversations. It was parts of apartheid society which were unspoken, and this is part of the complicity, that things were not lanced. They were there, they were acknowledged, and everyone knew why he died. And again, this comes up in the fragments and shards over many years, 20, 30 years of speaking to people as they age, as they say things in other contexts, as they make comparisons, as one talks about one's own relationships and say, well, this happened, look what happened to him. So it's silenced then, it's acknowledged, but it's silenced. And when do we understand apartheid's violence? I'm afraid I don't know if a lot of South Africans have, of the white persuasion have acknowledged that then. And we find that in this, if you feel like a blood pressure raising exercise every morning when you wake up, my friends, please subscribe to News 24 and read the comments. That will show you that for many white folk, that denialism, that whitewashing, that rephrasing, restating hasn't actually gone anywhere. It is still there. That apartheid was somehow this peaceful, progressive society where there was no potholes, no murders, and I don't know, one stopped reading at a certain point. But that for me is the frustrating part of histories of white people, that there's this, and this is part of why I wrote this book, that there's this utter failure to come to grips with the past. And I can understand with people of myself and Albert's generation, if we go into Bloemfontein, we're not going to win any conversations, but I worry about when I was at the University of Pretoria, the University of the Free State. We tried to talk about Biko, we tried to talk about Turner, we tried to talk about history. And there were certain points when discussions just stopped. You know, while people might be too polite to walk out of your class, you could see that there's stop coming down their face. So these acknowledgements are not there. And what I've done in a history like this was to try and give people some analytic and political and moral off-ramps to show that there's lots of ways to be a white person. You don't have to be a white person as one of however many million you are. There's many, many ways. And there's also something called agency, which allows you to plot new things. That was the polemic purpose behind this sort of history, to show those alternate ways of imagining, which is fundamentally what a radical history ought to do. It should give you the possibility of imagining new futures. And that's what I wanted to do with this history, to try and get us around this absolute denial, which is still so apparent. So, and pardon for, it's something I do feel quite strongly about, so pardon me for going on about it a little while.
Not at all. The last question, Professor.
Thank you so much, Neil. I'm so glad. Thank you for your presentation. Such a powerful reminder of who you are in these spaces of conversation, knowing the impact of your work at Free State, where I was around the same time. But I'm so glad you just mentioned radical history. There's something that has been niggling, just looking at this picture, something niggling in my mind about this idea of complicity and what it means and the difficulty in people actually facing that sort of responsibility. And what's niggling is, to what extent are people really unable, not to deny the notion of a deep sense of whiteness, but to rather confront the fact that there is a possibility that people really truly, truly in quotes, it's not so much a denial, but there is this sense of really not knowing.
Yes.
I've been thinking since Nell talks about your book and now you're coming here today, I've been thinking about Hitler's willing executioners. And that book was published around 95, thereabouts. But this was like the wave of sort of reflection on the, of now I'm talking as a psychologist, of the transgenerational issues of trauma, mostly around the Holocaust and those histories. In fact, even the work of the historian La Capra emerged in a way focusing on these issues around that period. There's a lot of, literature scholars and so on reflecting on these questions. And what I wonder about, and would like you to think with us about, is this idea that there is a sense in which people don't know. You can put that in scare quotes, but it's so deep. This deep sense of whitening of the body and the whitening of the mind, that actually it's not just a separation, apartheid of, the geographic separation and the, special privileges, but it's an apartheid of the mind.
Yes, absolutely.
That there is that sense of a deep sense of, you are at that place. But at the same time, there is also a knowing that there's something wrong about this. And so there is this tension that is, you are so much you embody this kind of apartheid of the mind. But there is also a knowledge that this is why when you say, let's talk about Biko, there is a freezing. What's the freezing about? It's because you know something,
Yes.
but you dare not know it. And so it seems to me that our task really is so much more complicated than simply speaking about whiteness and what is visible and from the perspective of historical. But we also have to engage with those kinds of complexities that we are faced with these questions that are actually, that complicates the picture. If we are concerned about transformation. You spoke about the Y2K generation. And when we think in that way, that we realize the task is so much bigger.
Yes.
You know, if you think about that kind of tension. I wonder I would like to hear what you say, you know, your views and in response. Would really love to hear.
Prof Lincoln, would you like to answer?
Yeah, to relate on what you've been saying, just a very brief comment. And I don't normally bring my own history into academic discussion. I try to keep that apart. I'm going to break my own rule now. But what has struck me is, and I've been battling with this as I get older, that what happened in one's life and why didn't one's parents behave and educate us as I think they should have been more forthright in what's wrong with the country. My father definitely alerted me to certain things, but I think if I'm being sympathetic to where they were at, I would say they were concerned because they didn't have the answers either. And you always, as I've got 3 children and 1 grandchild, so one is very protective, and you haven't got the answer. How do you deal with that? How do you tell them? What do you tell them? Yeah? Where must they go? How must they deal with this? They're caught in this cocoon of whiteness. Do you want to send them outside? Is that a realistic assumption? And I just think that they were scared themselves, but they can't afford to be open about their own lack of understanding, their own involvement in it, because they haven't got the answers either at that time. Yeah.
And it's notable that you mentioned that they couldn't afford to be. And it ties to what you were speaking about, what it means to be white, what it meant to be white. Stellenbosch, because whiteness requires you to know, to have answers, to never question.
Yeah, it's like the air that we breathe, you know.
So
Anyway, sorry, that was just...
thank you, Prof. Lincoln.
Let me try and answer the 2 questions. I'm going to try and answer systematically Prof. Pumla's question, and Prof. Albert's question I'm going to also answer with an anecdote from my mother and father who feature in this book. I think when we look at Biko and Turner, 2 intellectuals who are contemporaneous in Durban, both give very wise and very, very gentle lessons to young whites of the 1970s, before the Soweto uprising. And they urge young whites that their greatest task is to understand themselves, to free themselves from this affective, psychological, emotional prison which keeps them white, which keeps them in the prisons of whiteness. Both Biko and Biko perhaps more, in fact, more, I would argue, more gently and carefully than Turner, but it's a theme which comes out in both of those scholars who address themselves to white people. Biko's writings there are often missed, his comments there. So that's the first point. That we do have these long genealogies of appeals, and they almost sound like liberal appeals of liberation figures old to the segregationist authorities to just listen, to hear us, to open your ears. This is what Biko and Turner are urging young people. The task has become more complicated as generational knowledge has filtered down. And I do feel that as a profession of historians, as a generation of teachers, we've failed. There was a great. I taught university history, well, I suppose through the early 90s until people finally found me out and promoted me. And I feel that there were hard questions about identity which we were afraid to ask, and we were often too quick to descend into easy nationalist historiographies that made everyone very happy and proud. And people could walk around and point to white historians and say, okay, that's a progressive someone there. And I think particularly of my University of Pretoria and my University of Free State years. And we did not help young white scholars, young white academics think through these questions. And as a result, we defaulted their knowledge to the kind of knowledge which Jonathan talks about in Knowledge in the Blood. At the University of Pretoria, I tried to set up a BICO reading group for young white students, some of whom were battling with questions of identity and where they belonged. It was a dismal failure. How many did I get? 0. How many did I get next week? 0. How many did I get the week after? 0. And again, my fault then. Perhaps I needed to frame it differently. Perhaps I needed to be more of a human and more of a teacher, and guide people to where I wanted them to think. But I do agree that until we can create the intellectual structures to help people step out of the prisons of whiteness, because remember, some of the major writers on race, not least of all W.E.B. Du Bois, he says that the real burden of race falls not on black people, but on white people who learn to not love humanity and to hate black people. Until we can provide as intellectuals the steps out of that, the intellectual steps out of that. And there might be other ways, but I'm a historian and I talk from the point of view of a historian. So I, as a historian, can provide some of the steps to escape that. Then I don't think there's going to be much chance of young white people escaping that prison of the mind. You can send them to America, you could send them to Oxford, and I don't think it does a whole lot. And I'm breaking my own rules here, and I'm talking in broad terms of generalization, because there are a lot of young white people who've become exemplary citizens, who have embraced ideas of solidarity, not only in this country, but with oppressed people in other parts of the world, like Palestine and parts of South America, in most amazing ways. Students who expressed solidarity with the Fees Must Fall movement, fundamentally a movement which affected the poor students who were black students. So again, I'm talking in general terms about those white students and young people who've not been able to escape the sort of negations of whiteness, these awkward conversations around it. So I suppose that is my answer there. And briefly on Albert's point, with my parents, it's that perhaps they don't have the answers. 1 minute, okay. It's I find in the case of my mother, I don't think she had the answers, and not if she did have the answers, she didn't want them spoken. Again, there's lots in apartheid society from whites, which is known, but which isn't ever spoken about. My mother was like that. In year I was talking to someone in the year 1987. There was a queer student society formed at the University of Natal, and my mother's poor aging heart was deeply hurt when her one and only pitched up as a member of the Queer Student Society. Similarly with my involvement in politics. My father, on the other hand, he had very few words. He had 3 years of education, and he was a waiter, yet he knew and he understood in deeply wise ways. He knew, for instance, when I dodged the draft, he'd been a war veteran. He'd fought in the Battle of El Alamein as a teenage soldier. He'd fought the fascists in Italy. He knew why I was dodging the draft, and he didn't need a long, complicated explanation. He just knew that this wasn't a proper war.
Thank you for listening to the AVRIC podcast. For more insights, research, and reflections, visit our website or follow us online and join the reparative journey.